Funny that the gospel talks today about being sure to wash your hands. So in the current situation of the world, it's actually a good idea, as you know. But to speak about what's important. It's interesting that the first reading from Deuteronomy gives the exhortation you shouldn't subtract or add to any of these statutes or decrees, but keep them all just as they are. Might have kind of like an Old Testament sound to it, but actually, if you look at almost the very last verse of the Scriptures, almost the very last verse of the book of Revelation, it says, "Whoever adds to these things," literally puts on to these things, "the Lord will put on to him or add to him all the punishments and plagues of this book. And whoever subtracts anything from them, the Lord will subtract his or her portion from the tree of life." So it's right there too. But of course, if you think about it, and especially if you read the gospel today, that's kind of tricky. Not only when are you adding and subtracting actually, and to what? What does it mean? What are you adding and subtracting to? Just a list of requirements? Doesn't sound right. It's true we have to be careful of just adding merely human traditions, as Jesus says, and quoting Isaiah in the gospel today. There was a very excellent book which I used from my priestly studies by the famous French Dominican theologian Chenu, who was arguably the greatest ecclesiologist of the 20th century, whom was named a cardinal at the end of his life by Pope John Paul II. So we knew what he was talking about. It was called Tradition, capital T, and Traditions, small t. And there's the grand tradition, which even the Second Vatican Council reminded us is one of the sources of revelation, tradition with a big T. But of course, as he points out in the book, there are lots of other little traditions that, come in almost sometimes like barnacles, added over time and not always to the best use, for the best, and of course time bound and you can come and go, and if you let them come and let them go when it's time. But it actually goes deeper than that. If you read the whole of Mark 7 here, not just the select verses which we have today, Jesus reminds the Pharisees how they say, you don't have to honor your father and mother, one of the great commandments, the fourth commandment, if you dedicate, in your will, and we'd say in our day, this is going to be dedicated to the church. So you don't have to bother taking care of your parents if you want to give all your money to the church. And he says that's not honoring your father and your mother. But the evangelist goes on to explain when Jesus said that nothing can defile you that comes into your mouth, but only these evil thoughts that come out of your mouth, come out of the heart, And the evangelist adds a little parenthesis that says, thus he declared all foods clean. Wow, that was subtracting a whole lot from the law that Deuteronomy says you're not allowed to subtract anything from. All that kosher, all those rules about clean and unclean foods. Jesus, who was a Jew to the very end, said no. And if you look at the way he treats, he's always going around curing on the Sabbath and opening to people who are supposed to be excluded, to Samaritans, to lepers, to prostitutes, to sinners, to tax collectors. He was purposely subtracting, to say the very least, from the law that God himself gave. So it's a tricky thing when you say, what is the thing that we're really supposed to be keeping intact and not subtracting from or adding to? And there's a very good contemporary book, just a slim little volume that's just packed with wisdom by Father Richard Rohr called What Do We Do with the Bible? And one of his main points that he elaborates in some detail in the book is, well, what did Jesus do with the Bible? The observant Jew makes the point that, in some detail that I was just making, that Jesus neglects and even negates big swaths of the law and of the revelation. Why? Because he's centered on the revelation, which is himself and his main theme of love, of universal forgiveness on the part of God and therefore on our parts to all our brothers and sisters, opening up as he did, the community, as I said, the Good Samaritan, the leper, the one that was healed and the one that gave thanks. Get beyond your cultish, little tribal mentality to be open to the fullness of the God of the universe, the God who reveals his unstinting and uncalculating and unrelenting love to all people of all time, especially those whom in our little tribes we want to exclude. That's the revelation. It's the one commandment that Jesus gave us at the very end. This one commandment, as I enter into my passion and leave this world, this is the one thing I want you to remember. Love one another as I have loved you. In other words, with the same kind of bold and, incredible love and openness to the world that I showed in myself. The iconoclastic, breaking open all the systems, including my own religion, Jesus says, including my own Judaism, but for all times and all places, make sure that our Catholicism or our Christianity or whatever it might be is open to the full dimensions of the revelation of God's love. The prodigal son, all the parables of God's universal love, which is always ready to forgive and is always present to all people of all time. So anything that subtracts whatever little tradition or custom or belief system or whatever in your attitude or your formulas or in your behavior subtracts from that universal vision of God's infinite, unstoppable love, that's what it means to subtract. And you can't add anything, no custom or belief or rule or view that adds something that would negate that. That's the revelation that has to be preserved. That's the one tradition that no little t traditions can detract from. We have to keep that one great revelation, that one great tradition of God's love that Jesus revealed in his actions, in his life, and in his death and resurrection. That's what we're called to witness to and to be faithful to. So we can't let anything detract from that one view. It's funny, religious groups of all stripes, including Christianity and certainly including Catholicism, love to narrow it down, for our own tribal purposes. I always like to joke, and I think I got this from Richard Rohr as well. If you look at the Baltimore Catechism, the one that I grew up with, one of the first questions is, where is God? And it says, jubilantly and confidently, God is everywhere. Okay, but then it spends the rest of the catechism trying to prove that God is only present in the Roman Catholic Church, in baptized members who are in the state of grace. Otherwise, God ain't there. Well, which is it? You can't have your system and your beliefs and your structures narrow down God's love and God's presence, who is especially there where he seems to be absent, just as Jesus was. That's the grand revelation. So anything, here's your little rule of thumb, anything that makes more narrow and exclusive our understanding and sense and experience of God's action in the world and in human hearts, that is false. That's subtracting or adding something wrong to the revelation of the one truth of God's universal, constant, unbounded, and gratuitous love. You can't stop it. And that's exactly what the second reading says. We begin in the letter of James today, where it says, every good gift, every wonderful offering, every wonderful gift comes down. What does the actual translation say here? All good gift, every perfect gift is from above, from the Father of lights, in whom, it adds, there is no shadow of change. So this is God's eternal and infinite way. What's his eternal, infinite way? Giving every possible and perfect good gift from above. That's who God is. Nobody and nothing else. Perfect gifts descending with incalculable abundance from his love and his mercy into the world. And that's what we're called to witness to ourselves. As the last verse says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God is taking care of orphans and widows, who, as you know, in those days were those that fell through the safety net. No family, so orphans and widows, who was going to take care of them? There wasn't Social Security. So to whom does that correspond in our own time? The most neglected, the most marginalized. You can fill in the blanks. You can take your favorite category. That's what it means. A love that reaches out beyond the levels of comfort of our, little pure tribes, out into the world to reveal, to discover God at work there, and to facilitate and further that and foster that by our own actions. Keep oneself unstained by the world, meaning the worldliness of greed and egotism, which can be in church and religion as well as government and business, etc. It certainly is. To open ourselves, to that. To the love which goes beyond all the limitations and then all the categories. And by the way, again, they left out some verses here. If you look at the whole passage, it says, the anger of men does not work and it's usually men, the anger of men does not work the justice of God. And it also says, if anyone doesn't bridle his tongue and considers himself religious, he's a fraud. So go onto social media and see how much anger and hatred, hate speech is there, and you tell me, often in the name of conservative religion or conservative this or that, who's adding and who's subtracting to the great revelation and the grand tradition of Jesus, his behavior, his life, his teaching, and his death and resurrection, of God's unstinting and unbounded love for all people of all time. So what do we do with the Bible? What do we do with tradition? Use it as Jesus did. Whatever favors and nurtures and furthers the practice and understanding of God's unbounded and unremitting love, that is the tradition, and that's the revelation, and that's the truth. Don't add a thing to that, and don't dare subtract a thing from that, or don't subtract anybody from that. Otherwise, as the letter says of James, it's false religion. It's just a fraud, pretending to be pure and divine and keeping the tradition. So you can't say that, anything that's not the theology or the devotion of the Council of Trent or something like that. No, go back to the beginning. Go back to Jesus himself, his words, his life, and his death. That's the revelation. That's the tradition. Don't add to it. And don't subtract from it.